I've always had a special passion for places where it seems the very earth whispers the history of ancient epochs. So when I heard about the discovery of unusual fossils in a remote sedimentary basin in southwestern Arizona, I immediately jumped at the chance to head out there alone. There was no official expedition planned, but I wasn't afraid of the prospect of conducting research far from big cities and familiar infrastructure. In fact, it was the ideal setting, surrounded by barren wastelands, bare rocks, and sand, with a climate so harsh that any living creature could easily vanish in this realm of scorching sun. Leaving the last small town behind, I drove along a deserted road winding among withered shrubs and rocky plateaus. The deeper I ventured into the desert, the more I was overtaken by an unsettling yet oddly pleasant feeling, as if I were crossing a boundary of the everyday. In these parts, it almost never rains, and the sedimentary layers I planned to study emerged from the ground like scars on the body of the desert, deep and etched by time. Sunlight reflecting off the grayish-brown deposits made them look like exotic strata, seemingly hundreds of thousands of years old. As I made my way to the chosen site, my eyes involuntarily scanned the horizon for anything curious: rock outcrops, fragments of stone that might harbor the remains of ancient animals. Here, far from the clamor and concerns of city life, I intended to spend several days in silent company with the past. The air was so dry that each breath felt like scorching needles piercing my throat. Yet I was used to such a climate, accepting the heat as an intrinsic part of this enigmatic land. After setting up camp on a small plateau, I looked around. There wasn't a soul in sight. Only an oppressive silence, broken now and then by gusts of wind carrying fine grains of sand. Surveying the area, I figured the best starting point would be the nearest outcrop, where the sedimentary layer jutted out almost perpendicularly from the earth. In my experience, such strata often conceal fossils, bones or remnants of fauna compressed under layers. Sometimes they even yield traces of human activity, though the likelihood of that was slim. I was more intrigued by the large mammals and predators of bygone eras. As evening descended, I lit a small fire. Flickering sparks soared toward the pale, starry sky as I watched their dance in quiet contemplation. A strange, mixed sensation welled within me. The thrill of potential scientific discoveries intermingled with an inexplicable chill, as if someone were watching me from the darkness. I tried to dispel the mounting unease, but the desert, steeped in countless legends and stories, seemed too alive to remain indifferent to the presence of a stranger. Tomorrow I planned to begin full-scale excavations, measuring out areas, taking samples. Yet from the very first step, this land hinted that it held not only scientific mysteries. Legends of sinister beings that haunt desert nights, stories I once dismissed as mere ghost tales, crept into my mind. Local tribes like the Hopi, Navajo, and others had for centuries passed down myths of shamans capable of shape-shifting. I hadn't given these tales much thought before, but now, amid the deepening darkness, they made me uneasy. Perhaps it was just the imagination of a traveler weary from the long journey, but my heart began to beat a little faster than usual. The night plunged me into a half-sleep where the sand and stars seemed one. I tried to console myself with the thought that science would eventually explain any tale. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes reality is far more terrifying than any legend. Those exposed, desolate sedimentary layers appeared as though they could tell a story that didn't fit into any textbook. After half an hour of battling sleep, I finally dozed off, slipping into a semi-delirious state on the edge of wakefulness and slumber. The deep silence of the desert enveloped me, its rhythm merging with the beating of my heart. Flickers of gigantic wolves tearing through the nocturnal stillness flashed before my inner eye. Just fantasies, I reminded myself, letting the thoughts fade. Tomorrow, everything would be clearer, or perhaps far grimmer. That was a question only time could answer. I awoke a little before dawn to sounds resembling the piercing cry of the wind. Perhaps, somewhere in the distance, a coyote was indeed howling, its voice echoed and distorted by the rocks. After a quick breakfast, I gathered my tools: brushes, a small hammer, a scraper knife, and several plastic containers for samples. The sun slowly emerged over the horizon, and the sand began to heat up, scorching even through my boots. I made my way to the outcrop of sedimentary layers I had examined the previous day through my binoculars. As I got closer, I noticed that part of the ground had recently collapsed, likely after winter rains, revealing a new surface that might yield discoveries. I turned on my portable recorder to document my observations and carefully began scraping away the top layer. Soon, fragments of bone emerged, barely noticeable pieces jutting from the dry, dusty rock. At the sight of the bones, my heart leaped with excitement. As a paleontologist, one becomes accustomed to stumbling upon fragments of ancient animals. Yet every new find, even a small shard, ignites the thrill of discovery. I continued clearing away the debris and soon uncovered something truly remarkable: a vertebra, and nearby, several jointed ends resembling fragments of limbs. Typically, such bones could be attributed to some kind of wolf or large canine, but here an astonishing detail awaited. One of the vertebrae appeared to have been neatly cut, not cracked or naturally broken, but with a clear incision as if made by a blade. Its surface was smooth, marked with impressions reminiscent of enormous dental imprints. It seemed that the bone had not only been gnawed, but partially sawed through, though the precision of the cut made it hard to believe it was the work of a primitive human wielding stone tools. I stared at that vertebra, trying to comprehend what could have left such a bizarre mark. On one hand, a predator could be responsible, if it were a rather large wolf or perhaps an extinct relative of modern coyotes. It might have bitten through the bone. But what troubled me was the break. Too neat, as if artificially made. Touching that fragment filled me with unease, as if I were handling a secret I wasn't meant to know. I took several photos and sketched diagrams in my notebook. I cleared away a bit more of the rock and stumbled upon 2 incisors embedded in a layer of silt. Their root impressions were set in dry clay, and I determined that these teeth were clearly more robust than those of modern wolves of similar size. I couldn't shake the feeling that all these findings were connected to some creature unknown to science. Or, at the very least, a predator that behaved and fed in a manner completely contrary to our expectations. Strange thoughts began to bubble up in the depths of my mind. What if some of the local legends about shapeshifters or shamans who changed their appearance weren't baseless after all? I tried to dismiss such notions, adhering to my scientific methodology where every explanation must be grounded in fact. Yet the evidence before me, this bone, seemed to scream that someone or something had done something unusual. The more I examined it, the more a shiver ran through me. Not knowing what to think, I carefully packed the vertebra into a container and continued my search for larger fragments. Unfortunately, I didn't uncover a significant portion of the skeleton. It felt as though the remains had been deliberately removed or scattered. Perhaps erosion had done its work, or maybe the predator to which they belonged had fallen victim to another beast. Either way, by midday, I felt it was time to leave and ponder what I had seen. Returning to camp, I sat for a long time in the scant shade of my tent, scrutinizing the bone. The air shimmered with heat, and I couldn't shake the thought that I had witnessed something sinister. "All right," I told myself, "don't jump to conclusions." Yet deep down, a suspicion was stirring that these lands held not merely fossils, but a dark history that could spring to life at any moment. I didn't yet know how close that might be to the truth. I had planned to spend the rest of the day on further excavations and a more detailed survey of the area, but something happened that changed my intentions. As I was mulling over the vertebra, a person appeared in the distance. His figure, shimmering through the hot desert air, was rapidly approaching. I stood up and strained my eyes, trying to discern who could be out here in such a desolate place. When he came closer, I saw he was a native, a man of short stature but solidly built. His face exuded a measure of wisdom and calm, and his dark eyes held a penetrating, strangely soothing look. He introduced himself as Noden, a name spoken in a hushed tone that carried echoes of an ancient language. I didn't know exactly which tribe he belonged to, but I guessed he might be Navajo or from a related people. With a gesture, Noden indicated that night was falling and that it would be best to spend it under the protection of the rocks, where the wind was gentler and a fire could be built. I felt a deep respect for this man who offered such simple yet invaluable help to a stranger. Gathering my things, I followed him. We moved slowly yet surely, carefully navigating loose patches of ground until we reached a small crevice where we could build a fire pit. After kindling the fire, we sat facing each other, the crackling flames between us sending up a thin column of smoke. Nights in the desert are cold, while daytime temperatures can soar to extreme heights. After sunset, the air cools almost instantly. Noden tossed a few twigs onto the fire and looked at me with unmistakable interest. I realized I needed to speak cautiously about my find so as not to appear as a naive newcomer, yet I didn't want to miss the chance to learn something known only to the locals. I briefly described how I had uncovered bones resembling a wolf's skeleton, but with enormous bite marks and a strange cut on one of the vertebrae. Noden listened silently, yet I saw a flicker of alarm deep in his eyes. Finally, he nodded and began to speak, in broken English interspersed with unfamiliar words from his own language. I caught the gist. These lands were considered special, even sacred. According to legend, a great shaman once dwelled here, dedicating his life to the dark magic of transformation. People feared him. And even after his disappearance, the tribe's elders passed down warnings from generation to generation, not to wander at night, nor to disturb the desert spirits capable of taking on the form of beasts. As I listened, I couldn't help but feel a strange blend of curiosity and primal fear welling up inside me. Stories of skinwalkers, shapeshifters, and other supernatural beings were nothing new. I'd read about them in the folklore of the indigenous peoples of the United States. But hearing them spoken of right here, with nothing around us but moonlight and an endless plain, left an indelible impression. Every rustle of the wind seemed to hint at some unseen presence. Looking into Noden's eyes, I saw that he wasn't trying to scare me. He was speaking sincerely, without any trace of mystification. He was more intent on warning me against reckless actions than stoking my curiosity. Yet for me, as a scientist, such legends were a powerful impetus. Perhaps they concealed a kernel of truth about what kind of creature could have left those marks on the bones. We sat by the fire until deep into the night. The faint crescent moon illuminated nearby boulders, each casting distorted patterns on the sand. It felt as though the desert was breathing under those stars, coming alive in the cool of the night. I felt a profound respect for Nodin. Not only was he a keeper of ancient traditions, but he also shared with me the relentless pursuit of truth. As sleep began to overtake me, I spread a mat beneath an overhanging rock by the fire. Nodin promised to keep watch for part of the night, and I felt a measure of safety in that companionship. Earlier, I had been alone in these vast expanses. Now, with him by my side, I believed no predator would easily approach. Drifting off to the crackle of the embers, I saw again that eerie vertebra with its unsettling cut. Suddenly, I was seized by a conviction. Whatever had happened in ancient times wasn't over. Here, in these sedimentary basins, the past and the present could collide, unleashing a storm for which I was hardly prepared. But there was no time for doubts. I was already caught in a whirlwind of legends and reality, with no way back. My sleep was light, whether due to nervous tension or the unusually cold desert night. I couldn't fully surrender to oblivion. I woke several times, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Somewhere far off, beyond sight, the wind moaned continuously, and in the pauses between its gusts, strange sounds emerged as if someone were murmuring indistinct words. Close to midnight, I heard Nodin abruptly rise. He stood by the dying embers, tensing as he stared into the darkness. I immediately sensed that something had happened. Getting up, I grabbed my flashlight, and my heart skipped a beat when a muffled roar echoed from behind the rocks. It was reminiscent of a wolf's howl, but lower, vibrating, and strangely human in its fury. The hair on my neck stood on end. I couldn't believe I was actually hearing that. Before I could fully get to my feet, a silhouette emerged in the moonlight. It moved quickly and menacingly on all fours, yet with a peculiar, almost human-like posture, as if a person had gotten on all fours. Its eyes glowed with a pale, fiery light, and its maw appeared capable of engulfing an adult head. I heard Nodin cock his gun. Clearly he was prepared. A shot rang out, and for a brief moment everything was bathed in a flash of fire. The creature recoiled, emitting a dreadful howl that sent shivers down my spine. My mind refused to accept what it saw. This beast resembled a wolf, but was obviously larger and had unnaturally elongated limbs. The way it blinked, if you could call it that, instantly reminded me of a human expression of pain and rage, as if two entities, predator and man, were struggling within it. Stunned by the shot and my own racing thoughts, I froze, uncertain which way to run. But Nodin didn't hesitate. He shouted a short word, perhaps a curse or a call to spirits, and fired again. The creature began to retreat, disappearing into the shadow of a cliff. Seizing a brief lull, I grabbed my flashlight and tried to illuminate the area, but the thick darkness of the desert seemed to swallow its beam. Nodin signaled that we couldn't stay here. He dashed to his belongings, grabbed what he could, and began descending the slope, urging me to follow. I realized that engaging in combat with a creature capable of shrugging off a bullet was tantamount to suicide. We ran downhill, dodging rocks and potholes, frequently glancing back. In the moonlight, it was impossible to tell whether the beast was still pursuing us, yet its roars echoed from the left and right, as if it were circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Adrenaline pounded at my temples, and I felt a burning pain in my chest from my labored breathing. Every sound seemed to herald another attack, and I began to doubt that I'd escaped this nightmare alive. At one point, Nodin forcefully shoved me aside, and that's when I realized I had nearly tumbled into a crevice between the rocks. We sprinted until we reached a flatter patch, where we paused for a few seconds to catch our breath. I stole a glance at his gun. Did Nodin still have any bullets left? Judging by his worried expression, probably not many. And judging by the creature's cries, it was still nearby. Suddenly, an eerie silence fell for a moment, and I sensed something approaching. I wasn't mistaken. A massive shadow burst from the darkness, knocking me off my feet. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as I realized the creature's teeth had torn through the fabric of my jacket, leaving deep scratches on my skin. Noden managed to rush over and, at the very last second, fired point blank, forcing the beast to emit a gurgling groan and recoil. Pinned to the ground, I could see in the moonlight the outline of the creature's head, a stretched-out maw, a bloodied snout, and a wild glint in its eyes. Suddenly, it let out a hoarse groan, and for a moment it seemed to straighten on its hind legs. Was that the cracking of bones or just the sound of my own heart? In a single leap, it vaulted over a boulder and disappeared. I was stunned and disoriented, wanting to scream but only managing to cough up a cloud of dust. We didn't wait for another attack. Clutching my injured shoulder, I sprang to my feet, and Noden and I dashed off again without pausing. Terrifying howls echoed intermittently, as if the desert itself had closed in around us. Yet the will to survive outweighed my terror, and each subsequent step felt like a desperate lurch through an impenetrable nightmare. At that moment, I realized that scientific discoveries and this expedition no longer mattered. Only survival, escape, and finding even temporary refuge from that abomination. It felt as though we'd been running all night. In truth, it was probably no more than half an hour, but fear and exhaustion warped my sense of time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting that dark silhouette to reappear. Each time, the darkness replied with silence or teased me with ghostly shadows flickering at the edge of my vision. Noden said almost nothing, merely gesturing short, decisive motions to indicate which way to run. I struggled to keep pace even as the wound on my shoulder burned and bled. The loss of most of our equipment and supplies meant that our chances of survival were slim unless we reached the nearest settlement. Then, I suddenly realized that the keys to my car were still in my jeans pocket. A small glimmer of hope. If only we could get to where I had parked, we might drive away, find medical help, and alert others to what had happened. Finally, under the eerie glow of the moon, I recognized the familiar outline of a rocky hill at the foot of which lay my camp. There, too, was my car. My heart skipped a beat at the thought that the creature might have already torn off the tires or shattered the windows. But there was no alternative. Staying in the desert meant certain death, and here at least there was a chance. I raced to the camp and dashed to the car. To my surprise, it was untouched. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the keys and inserted them into the ignition. After a few cranks, the engine roared to life, the grinding sound unpleasant yet reassuring. I shoved some of our equipment off the seat, tossed Noden's gun into the back, and gestured for him to climb in. He settled into the passenger seat, still clutching the few remaining rounds. We were both in shock, breathing heavily, but as the car lurched forward, we began to believe that we could escape. The headlights cut through the thick darkness, revealing shards of rock and thorny bushes. I could barely keep the steering wheel steady, and the narrow, rutted dirt road made every turn a challenge. Every meter we covered felt like a step toward safety, yet I kept expecting a dark silhouette to dart out onto the road at any moment. Two feelings warred within me: fear of encountering an unknown beast and a desperate determination to keep running without stopping. We sped along as fast as the broken road would allow. When the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I noticed a faint light in the distance. perhaps from a small roadside station or gas station. I steered toward it, hoping that someone there could help. Closer to the highway, I saw a typical roadside stop. A small kiosk under a canopy, a couple of cars parked nearby, and a metal pole with a dim light atop it. We pulled over and shut the doors, and I, still staggering, made my way to the building. A man emerged from inside with a worried look. He immediately noticed my injury and the blood-stained clothing on Noden. I hurriedly explained that we'd been attacked by a huge wolf or something similar, and that we needed medical help and police contact. Though my story might have sounded outlandish, the state of our clothes and injuries made it clear we'd encountered something very serious. They provided us with a first aid kit and some water. Although Noden looked exhausted, he remained calm and helped me bandage my shoulder. I could hear someone calling the local police, reporting armed individuals, that is, us, and a wild-looking beast in the desert. I don't know how convincing their account was over the phone, but our condition left no doubt. Something terrible had happened. Sitting in the ambulance that soon arrived, I felt relatively safe for the first time. But that feeling was deceptive. The monster that had attacked us was still somewhere near those sedimentary basins. According to the legends, it could hide and return at will. Suddenly I recalled the eerie marks on the bones I'd unearthed. Perhaps what we saw was directly related to my discovery. The pounding in my temples grew louder as I tried to comprehend. The ancient tales of transformations and the dark shaman weren't mere folklore. Noden and I, with our fear and injuries, had confirmed their reality. Yet, at least for now, we had escaped death's clutches. Ahead lay questions from the authorities, skepticism from my colleagues, and my own inner conflict between scientific doubt and what I had witnessed firsthand. I was admitted to a room in the local clinic, where they treated my scratches and stitched up several wounds. Noden received help too, mostly for bruises and deep abrasions. The doctor, upon hearing our account, raised a skeptical eyebrow, but seeing how frightened we were, he refrained from pressing further, merely recording our injuries formally. Later, local police came to speak with me. I tried to describe the creature, but as the officer's expression grew increasingly grim with each word, I realized how implausible it all must have sounded. A couple of days later, when I finally regained some clear-headedness, I leafed through my notes on the wolf bone with the peculiar cut on its vertebra. I still had all the finds with me, and I planned to send the samples to my university's laboratory. Yet I understood that no matter what analyses were performed, it would only be a piece of the puzzle. We'd seen a creature that most certainly didn't belong in any biology textbook. Perhaps it was the last specimen of an extinct species, miraculously surviving in the desert? Or was there really a connection to otherworldly forces? From time to time, Noden would drop by. He wasn't much of a talker, but in his eyes I read that he, too, was wrestling with the inner conflict. Where does one draw the line between belief in ancient legends and the pragmatism of modern life? He told me he intended to return to his village to speak with the elders. As for me, I could only accept that official science wasn't ready to recognize such phenomena, and yet we both knew this was not the end. By the end of the week, I was allowed to leave the clinic. My shoulder still ached, but I was able to drive and manage my affairs. As I prepared to leave Arizona, I realized I would never be the same. The desire to understand what had truly happened continued to burn within me. On the night before my departure, I built a small fire near a roadside motel. I sat watching the flames, recalling the evening when I first learned of the legend of the shaman shapeshifter. Images of eerie bones with a sliced vertebra, glowing eyes, and an inhuman howl flooded my mind. I realized I now had a new purpose: to seek out any rational explanations. Yet simple logic suggested that if such a creature existed, it could appear and vanish almost without a trace. The desert is vast, and who knows how many similar stories have unfolded in its depths. I recalled a crumpled newspaper article from a few years back about the mysterious death of livestock and a cannibalistic wolf, which eventually faded into obscurity. Likely even then, people had encountered what we saw. But how could I tell the world without being branded insane? In the morning, I opened the trunk and carefully placed the boxes of bones inside. I faced a long journey back to the university, and in my mind a plan was taking shape: to interview local residents and study the folklore. Perhaps someone else held memories or documents that could confirm the reality of such creatures. Yet I knew that even if I gathered a mountain of evidence, official science would be slow to accept such conclusions. I might be dismissed as a sensationalist, or worse, a pseudoscientist. Before departing, I said goodbye to Noden. I didn't know if our paths would ever cross again, but I felt they would. As the wheels of my car rolled along the scorching highway, I cast one last glance at the horizon. The rocks, sedimentary layers, and clay ledges stood like ancient sentinels, unmoving and incorruptible. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a black silhouette dart across these desolate lands, but I didn't dare to look closer. Let this story remain with me as a reminder that the world is far more complex and frightening than we'd like to believe. The desert isn't just sand and stone, it's a universe in itself, capable of revealing time and again the fragile line between legend and reality. Story 2. I still remember that sweltering noon when the 5 of us university students decided to head into the remote mountains for field research. Tom, Jim, I, and 2 of our friends were all burning with enthusiasm to escape the city's hustle and bustle. The trip promised to be an unforgettable adventure: rare mountain rocks, unusual flora, and maybe even evidence of ancient settlements. Our route led us through an American Indian reservation. It was here that we turned off a relatively decent road to visit an acquaintance of Tom's. He had been in these parts before. His friend, named Castellan, lived in one of the village houses. When we arrived at the reservation, I was struck by the silence. A few dilapidated buildings jutted out of the dry, cracked earth. Nearby, gardens scorched by the blazing sun lay alongside low mountain ridges. It seemed that in these lands, time had either stopped or flowed at an entirely different pace. Castellan greeted us at the doorstep of his modest home. He was a middle-aged man dressed in jeans and a simple shirt. His face exuded a restrained yet deep seriousness. He invited us inside and served us strong herbal tea. Old photographs hung on the walls, images of people in traditional attire, like ghosts from the past silently watching us as if reproaching us for something unspoken. When Tom explained our goal, to venture deeper into the mountains for field research, Castellan grew somber. He began talking about an ancient evil supposedly imprisoned in the local stone slabs. According to him, local shamans had guarded these lands for centuries, keeping in check some monstrous force. Rumor had it that outsiders who dared disturb the sacred valley's peace either vanished without a trace or returned insane. Castellan urged us persistently to turn back before it was too late. We listened respectfully, but still dismissed it as another local legend. Science versus myths, we thought, quietly laughing to ourselves. After thanking our hospitable host for the tea, we stepped outside. The reservation seemed to see us off with the silent stares of the few passers-by. and along the roadside I noticed a low stone engraved with symbols. The sun beat down so fiercely that the very air seemed to hum with a silent plea. Do not go there. But we climbed into the car and continued our journey along the scorching country road leading to the mountains. Each one of us was eager to make some discovery. None of us suspected how close to the truth the warnings from the reservation might be. We felt protected by our knowledge, dismissing the legends as superstitious fabrications. The silhouettes of the mountains drew nearer, acquiring an increasingly somber majesty. The sky remained bright and cloudless. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to fear, yet deep inside, something stirred, a vague unease I attributed to the excitement before the unknown. It soon became clear that all those fears had a real basis. The first thing we noticed as we approached the mountain canyon was the complete absence of civilization. Trees gave way to bizarre rock formations, spiny bushes, and dried-up stream beds. Our equipment-laden car struggled along the dusty back road. The wide highway was far behind us now, and each mile had to be negotiated with utmost care. Before long, we reached the entrance to a narrow canyon where rocks jutted out like gigantic stone fangs. Tall limestone walls with deep cracks and sheer ledges towered over a narrow path littered in places with rubble. It seemed as if the canyon was wrapping us in a stony embrace. A strange, oppressive silence reigned. We found a relatively flat spot and decided to take a break. The sun was already setting, tinting the sky with rosy hues. The air was dry and had a bitter taste. We quickly pitched our tent, built a small fire, and heated up some canned food. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep within those stone labyrinths, something was lurking, listening to us. That night, we all felt compelled to take turns on lookout duty. There was no rational explanation for it, but intuition insisted that caution was needed. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of burning branches and peering into the darkness. The rocks cast bizarre shadows, and at times it seemed as though something moved at the edge of the light. I tried not to recall the warnings from the reservation and passed the time until dawn. Morning brought relief. We drank strong coffee, packed up camp, and moved on. The rocks grew closer together, and the car crept along in first gear, barely making its way through rocky obstacles. Eventually, the canyon opened up, and we saw massive boulders marked with strange notches. I recalled Cascalan's mention of the mysterious stone slabs. It seemed we had stumbled upon them. We got out to photograph the patterns on the stones. The carvings looked like a mix of pictograms and indecipherable symbols, occasionally merging into intricate circular designs. Some lines were scratched off as if someone had tried to peel away the top layer of the stone. My hands trembled as I took photos. The eerie energy of the place and the warnings of ancient evil unsettled my mind. That same day, we discovered a narrow cave whose entrance was half blocked by fallen rocks. With our flashlights, we squeezed inside. The air was stale and musty, and long scratches marred the walls, as if someone had desperately tried to break free. In the depths, a rustling sound reached our ears, perhaps the wind or maybe the scraping of something or someone trying to escape. A primal fear seized us, and we decided not to linger. On leaving the cave, the midday heat and a rising wind stirring up sand greeted us. We exchanged silent glances. The legends of ancient evil no longer seemed trivial. Yet none of us wanted to turn back. Our ambition and the thrill of research drove us onward despite our growing unease. Day by day, the atmosphere grew heavier. We set up camp in various spots, collected soil samples, and took photos, but the joy of discovery was gradually replaced by a profound gloom. At times, events occurred that defied scientific explanation. One night, a strange howl echoed through the canyon, rousing us from sleep. We bolted out with our flashlights, but saw no movement or tracks. An oppressive silence fell over us, as if the canyon itself were vigilantly watching the intruders. Under the moonlight, dark silhouettes of rocks emerged, and we stood there, staring into the ghostly landscape. The next day, I came across enormous paw prints with long claws. Next to them lay what might have been a wolf's paw, but it looked almost childlike. I called Tom over, and he just shrugged helplessly. None of us wanted to admit our terror, but we all understood. An unknown creature, unlike any predator we knew, was roaming these mountains. We tried to distract ourselves with our work, measuring the depths of fissures, studying rock carvings. Occasionally, we found remnants of ritual bonfires, circles of stones, and charred animal bones, evidence of ancient ceremonies. Cascalon's words about shamans who had once tried to restrain an evil force echoed in my mind. Now I understood. They truly had fought something horrifying, striving to confine or drive it away. As evening came, the wind grew stronger and heavy clouds began to cover the sky. There was no rain, only a strange electric tension hanging in the air. The fire crackled, throwing trembling shadows on the rocks which seemed to expand into threatening forms. That night, while on lookout, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I spun around with my flashlight, but saw no one. My heart pounded in my throat, and I felt goosebumps rise on my skin. It seemed as if we had trespassed into a place where we did not belong. The next morning, we discovered that one of our backpacks had been dragged away and torn apart by powerful claws. There was no doubt now. An unknown predator was stalking us. We decided to search for a safer spot to set up camp, but the narrow canyon with its sheer walls offered no alternatives. There was no way to descend by another route. Several times we found tufts of dark, coarse fur on the bushes. It wasn't from a coyote or a bear. On a large rock, we discovered carved pictograms. They depicted a creature resembling a wolf, but with abnormally long limbs and protuberances along its back. Nearby, figures of people with hands clasped in prayer appeared. It seemed to be an ancient warning for those who dared to come here. The deeper we ventured into the mountains, the more it felt as if nature itself had become paralyzed. There were no birds or animals, only sparse bushes and withered spines rustling in the wind. We paused to rest, and then we heard a deep rumble, as if a boulder had collapsed somewhere. The sound echoed away, and someone murmured that they felt an alien presence. By evening, we stumbled upon a flat area surrounded by scattered rock debris. We set up camp and lit a fire. The clouds above were tinted with crimson hues from the sunset, creating a ghastly, almost otherworldly scene. I felt like a character in a low-budget horror movie, yet everything was happening for real. That night, I could hardly close my eyes. To ensure no one was left alone too long, we shortened our lookout shifts. Through the ragged clouds, the moon occasionally peeked out, outlining the dark shapes of the rocks. More than once, I thought I saw quick silhouettes on the rock ledges, as if hunchbacked, four-legged creatures were watching us. My mind protested these visions, but my eyes confirmed them. When it was my turn to replace Jim on lookout, I approached the nearly dying campfire. As I tossed some kindling onto the flames, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around. There was no one. My heart pounded so fiercely I wanted to call out to the others, but I knew that would only wake everyone up. I stood there, tense, peering into the darkness, trembling from both cold and fear. In the morning, we finally decided that we couldn't stay any longer. The creature was clearly lurking nearby, waiting. As we packed up, we noticed fresh scratches on the rocks, and not far away, pieces of our tent fabric lay in shreds. Everything indicated that we were being deliberately intimidated, as if to make it clear we were not welcome. By day, an eerie calm prevailed. We searched for a way to escape or at least bypass the canyon, but the path led us deeper among the sheer walls. Every step threatened to collapse. One misstep and we could tumble down. At sunset, we heard a distant roar mixed with a guttural growl coming from deep within the canyon. We froze. Perhaps that was the very creature that had appeared briefly at the edge of our vision during the night. No one dared set up camp in the open. We were far too vulnerable. We pressed on in hopes of finding a resting spot at a higher elevation. After an hour of scrambling over loose rocks, we emerged onto a small plateau. There we discovered strange stone pillars with carvings, likely shamanic totems of an ancient tribe. On them, we could discern similar symbols: circles, zigzags, and stylized, toothed maws. The feeling of unease became almost palpable, as if the pillars themselves were warning us, the path beyond is forbidden. Yet, staying below where the beast was already stalking us seemed even more dangerous. We continued on, glancing furtively at the shifting shadows in the twilight. Night fell. The stars were nearly invisible behind heavy clouds. We found another ledge to camp on and struggled to pitch our tent. The fire burned weakly. There was little wood, and only dry, spiny brush was available. We huddled together, trying to see something in the utter darkness. Then it happened, when we were all on the verge of a nervous breakdown. A deep, guttural growl erupted from the darkness, and the creature suddenly burst into the beam of our flashlights. I recoiled against a stone wall, feeling my heart nearly leap from my chest. It couldn't have been a bear or a cougar. Its hunchbacked appearance and monstrous fangs matched no predator I knew. Tom, his hands trembling, fumbled a flare from his pocket. As the creature lunged, he pulled the trigger and the blazing charge struck its mouth, exploding in a dazzling flash. The monster roared, its claws scraping furiously against the stone floor. We watched as it thrashed desperately, trying to spit out the flare, and then, with a wild howl, it vanished into the darkness. We stood frozen, scarcely believing it was over so quickly. I trembled so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. Tom whispered about our incredible luck and noted that we no longer had any charged signal flares. The others stood pale and nearly breathless, but the beast did not disappear entirely. Its roar soon echoed from the other side of a ledge. It was clear that the wound had only enraged it further. We grabbed only the essentials and bolted down the canyon, as far away as possible from that place. We couldn't run for long. The canyon narrowed, and the night pressed down with relentless darkness. When we stopped to catch our breath, a rumble from falling stones resumed. The creature was following our trail, groaning from pain, yet refusing to retreat. We knew we had no chance for another confrontation. Desperately, we ran blindly, determined only to escape the sound of that terrifying roar. My head spun, my legs buckled, and I barely noticed where I was stepping. Then, barely audible, shots rang out, dry cracks echoing off the canyon walls. I thought I was imagining things, but then vague figures appeared in the beams of our flashlights. To my relief, among them I recognized Caskolen's face. Alongside him were two more Native Americans armed with rifles. They motioned for us to huddle against a wall. In that moment, from the darkness the creature lunged again, attempting to circle us. But our rescuers opened fire. Bullets struck the beast with dull thuds, and it roared before recoiling. The signal flare still burning in its mouth continued to smolder, and the creature, wildly shaking its head, retreated back into the darkness. We still could hardly believe what was happening. Moments earlier, we had been on the brink of death, and now people from the reservation had come to our rescue. Soon, the monster disappeared, its roar echoing faintly from the far reaches of the canyon. Perhaps it had fled after sustaining 2 severe wounds. A haunting silence settled over us. We could hear only our feverish coughs and the heavy breathing of our rescuers. Castellan, upon recognizing Tom and us, nodded quietly. In his eyes, I understood. He had expected we might run into trouble, and had come to help. There was no reproach in his gaze, only deep fatigue and sorrow, as if he knew too much about the evil lurking in these mountains. Without a word, they led us back, pointing out the way through the winding canyon. We carefully descended the loose rocks, aware that the beast might reappear. But the armed men seemed unfazed. They walked confidently, fingers poised on their triggers. Finally, in the dead of night, we emerged into a more open area where our vehicles were parked. There, exhausted, we collapsed onto the stones, trying to catch our breath. The rescuers too labored for breath, occasionally glancing back as if checking that no new attack was imminent. But everything remained quiet. By dawn, we returned to the reservation. The road that had taken us nearly a full day initially now seemed shorter, perhaps because Castellan, who knew the terrain well, guided us. I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The man from whom we had drunk tea asked not a single question. He understood it all. His friends looked at us with sympathy, aware that we had witnessed what they had long warned us about. They provided us with a room in one of the houses so that we could recover and at least drink some water. None of us could sleep. The monstrous figure was etched in our memories, and its deep, guttural growl still echoed in our ears. I tried to remain calm, but my hands trembled uncontrollably as my mind swirled with thoughts of what had transpired. After several hours, we mustered the courage to leave those lands. Castellan and his companions escorted us to the edge of the reservation to ensure no further attacks would befall us. We drove slowly, constantly glancing back, but the beast, it seemed, had dissolved into the mist of dawn. Just before we left, I caught another glimpse of that familiar memorial stone, inscribed with symbols. Now it no longer appeared to be just a mere souvenir. It seemed as if those hieroglyphs contained an eternal plea: do not awaken the evil. We had unwittingly disturbed an ancient force. Since that day, each of us has changed. We returned to the university with an entire collection of scientific materials and photographs. But the most significant discovery was that ancient legends sometimes prove more real than modern minds can imagine. The werewolf, or evil spirit, as the locals called it, truly existed. We never knew whether the creature had survived, hidden deep within the canyons, or if the injuries it sustained had been fatal. Yet whenever I hear the distant howl of the wind, I involuntarily recall that terrifying roar and the flash of a signal flare in its monstrous maw. And I still see the wary looks on the faces of our rescuers, who understood that evil does not vanish as long as it lives on in one of its forms. Perhaps one day it will make itself known again in those stone labyrinths, where shadows recede into an endless void. Story 3. My name is Edward, and I live in one of the bustling cities on the East Coast. One evening I received an unexpected letter from my friend James, who had settled years ago in an Indian reservation hidden in the Appalachian Mountains. He invited me to escape the urban clamor and spend some time immersed in silence and wild nature. the journey promised to be long. First, I bought a train ticket that would take me far to the west. The train's windows revealed a panorama of rolling hills gradually giving way to steeper mountain slopes. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery pink hues, as if warning of something mysterious and unsettling. I couldn't tear my eyes away from those distant peaks, which seemed like silent sentinels guarding stories buried deep within. Stories that city dwellers could only guess at. At one point, I even thought the wind carried a distant rhythm of drums, echoes of ancient rites, though perhaps it was just my imagination at play. When the train finally reached its last stop, another leg of the journey awaited. A few hours by bus along a winding road. With every mile, the landscape outside grew gloomier. Impenetrable forests seemed to close in around the narrow highway, and tall pines and firs swaying in the wind resembled ghostly giants. Rain clouds intermittently obscured the moon, and an uneasy feeling crept over me, as though I were heading toward something vast yet terrifying. Eventually, the bus pulled over at a small clearing surrounded by forest. The freshly revealed moonlight illuminated a mountain trail that stretched into darkness. Just another hour's walk separated me from the reservation. Laden with my backpack, I took a deep breath of fresh air and pressed on. I arrived at a wooden arch marking the reservation's entrance close to midnight. The tree canopies intertwined overhead, forming a sort of corridor bathed in the dim glow of the moon. The boards of a small footbridge over a stream creaked underfoot, and faint lights from houses could be seen ahead. Soft rustlings from nocturnal forest creatures reached my ears, a small animal scurrying by here, an owl hooting among the branches there. The entire atmosphere brimmed with an ancient wisdom, as if the very earth here safeguarded tales of forgotten times. The reservation lay amid hills fringed by dense forest. The houses were modest, many built of logs with simple roofs and small porches. I noticed totems and carved decorations that attested to a deep respect for tradition. There was no urban noise or artificial light here, only the steady glow of lamps at doorways and the occasional light from a window lost in the darkness. When I finally saw James, he silently waved me in, inviting me into his home. Inside, I was greeted by the scent of smoke and herbs and a comforting warmth emanating from the fireplace. I felt a deep sense of tranquility, yet I also detected an undercurrent of mystery. In the living room sat James's family. His mother regarded me with friendly kindness, and in a corner beneath an old patchwork quilt sat his grandfather, whom they called Samuel. Wrapped in a woolen blanket and holding a long-mouthed pipe, the deep wrinkles on his face spoke of many lived years, and his eyes reflected the wisdom of a generation. He glanced at me briefly, squinted one eye, and nodded as if both welcoming and assessing me. The night in the reservation passed quietly, though I failed to truly sleep. My mind whirled with impressions, ancient whispers, flickering lights, unfamiliar sounds of the nocturnal forest. When the morning sun rose, I awoke in a room lined with rough planks, the air heavy with the pungent aroma of bitter herbs. Breakfast was as simple and hearty as dinner: a slice of bread, boiled corn, and spiced meat. After the meal, Samuel gave me a nod before heading out into the yard. I wasn't sure what to expect next, but I felt that today the veil over the legends I'd only fleetingly heard about would be lifted. I sat down on an old bench beside James's grandfather, and he began to tell a story seemingly connected to these very lands, with the mountains, the forests, and the winds that roamed the trails. His voice was deep, as if resonating from the depths of time. I caught familiar words about wolf shapeshifters, but soon realized he was also speaking of other creatures. It turned out that besides legends of a wolf with a human mind, there were also tales of shamans who could transform into bears. In these lands, it was said that some particularly gifted shamans performed rituals that allowed them to borrow the strength of a bear, its unbridled fury and incredible endurance. Yet, possessing a human mind, they could harness that power either to protect their community or, conversely, to harm their enemies. The very act of transformation was frightening enough. But the legend spoke of something even more terrible. Samuel explained that if a bear shapeshifter were to bite a wolf shapeshifter, a hybrid would be born, a creature stripped of all reason and filled with pure bestial rage. His eyes flashed as he described this being, a massive body endowed with the cunning of a wolf and the unrestrained fury of a bear. No one could predict its behavior, for it answered to no rules. Only a blind thirst for blood and destruction drove it. According to Samuel, this hybrid would retreat into the darkest caves and emerge to hunt under the light of the moon. Many local residents dismissed all this as mere ghost stories. Yet in the reservation, people rarely spoke of it openly, for there had been cases of people and animals mysteriously disappearing in the vicinity. It was said that deep within the mountains lay caves that held not only stalactites and underground rivers, but also a monster whose hideous form reflected a disturbed balance in nature. As I listened to the story, a chill began to build within me. The legend seemed terrifyingly real, its roots reaching deeper than simple fabrication. I started to wonder if there might be a grain of truth in these old tales. An aura of threat over these lands that defies the logic of a modern city dweller. Before long, I found myself unwillingly beginning to believe Samuel's words. After hearing the tale of the monstrous hybrid, I could hardly sit still. Everything seemed steeped in secrecy. Every rustle of leaves, every gust of wind, as if reminding me of the ancient menace Samuel had described. Yet a new day was approaching, and with the first ray of sunlight filtering into my room came a glimmer of hope that the oppressive impression might ease a bit. I awoke with a faint anxiety that strangely mingled with curiosity. The entire previous evening and night had been permeated with stories of spirits, shamans, and cursed beings, and now I couldn't shake the thought that there might be a real basis for it all. When I looked out the window, I saw how magnificent and grand the surrounding nature was. Misty mountain slopes stretched off into the distance like an endless sea, and the peaks caught the early rays of the sun, transforming into golden silhouettes. It seemed as if the very Appalachians breathed mystery, ready to reveal themselves to anyone bold enough to peer into their heart. During the day, James and I decided to take a walk around the area. I couldn't resist suggesting that we explore some of the mountain trails mentioned in the legends. He merely nodded, though I detected a note of caution in his eyes. He understood that I was intrigued by Samuel's words, yet he didn't want to frighten or disappoint me. After all, his native land was full of such stories, and he knew how to approach them with a careful respect. We retrieved a small backpack from the storage and packed in some water, a bit of bread, and a hand-drawn map of the area. James explained that in these mountains the signal often gets lost, making reliance on modern navigators futile. I found a special charm in that, a direct contact with nature, as if returning to a time when people lived in harmony with the earth and could orient themselves by the sun and stars. We also grabbed sturdy boots and lightweight jackets. James warned that the weather here was fickle, and even on a bright day, a torrential downpour might suddenly occur. Preparing for our hike, I felt an inner thrill rising, as though the universe were preparing me for something extraordinary. And although I couldn't shake the eerie thoughts about shapeshifters, I knew that a walk in the mountains would allow me to experience and understand this mysterious land better, a place where legends merge with reality. Before long, we stepped out into the yard. The air was fresh and the sky clear. Yet in the distance, gray clouds were already gathering. It seemed that a barely perceptible breeze carried with it the sounds of a distant rustle. Perhaps the murmur of a mountain stream or the echo of something else entirely. I glanced at James. He stood motionless, staring into the horizon as if foreseeing impending trials. Without a word, we both understood that this day might prove pivotal in my quest to uncover the hidden heart of the Appalachians. Gathering my courage, I followed my friend, already feeling my pulse quicken with anticipation. Our route wound along narrow, moss-covered trails blanketed with fallen leaves. The sun gradually began to set, yielding the stage to something older and more mysterious. The forest around us came alive in its own way. By day, it appeared welcoming and peaceful, but by evening the atmosphere turned wary. The tree branches swayed and creaked, emitting sounds that repeatedly made me glance over my shoulder. I felt a growing unease, as though an invisible gaze was following our every step. At one point, we paused to catch our breath. The trail descended, and we found ourselves at a small gap between rocks. From there, a muted wind sighed, reminiscent of a distant moan. I felt as if an icy breath of the earth itself was emanating from the depths of that gap. James silently nodded and motioned for us to continue along the trail. Clearly, he did not wish to linger in such a gloomy place. I took a sip of water and followed, trying not to look back even though the eerie sensation clung to me. Twilight descended faster than I expected. Soon, the pale light dissolved into thick shadows, and sharp gusts of wind began to rock the trees more fiercely. Autumn leaves swirled in the air as if warning us of imminent danger. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a strange sound, either a howl or a low growl. My heart pounded faster, and images of the legend Samuel had recounted flashed through my mind. I didn't want to believe it could be true, but every instinct screamed that the danger was real. James and I decided to find a place to camp. Yet the forest seemed unwilling to let us settle. Branches snagged at our clothes, and underbrush threatened to block our path, as if nature itself were testing whether we were worthy of treading on its sacred ground at night. A branch snapped somewhere, and I jumped, expecting a monster to leap out from behind the nearest trunk. But ahead there was only a dense shadow spreading among the trees like a black web. When the sun finally disappeared, darkness descended upon the forest with a terrifying swiftness. We sensed that moving further could be perilous. It felt as if every step deeper into the night carried an increasing weight of pressure, as though the darkness itself were descending upon our minds. We stopped under a broad tree, trying to catch our breath and decide what to do next. My mind shouted, "We can't stay here!" Yet at the same time, another thought whispered that if evil truly existed, it was already waiting for us, and escaping its trap wouldn't be easy. Suddenly, another sound emerged from the darkness, a sound like heavy breathing. It was distant, yet distinctly audible through the rustle of leaves. Goosebumps raced over my skin, and my heart nearly stopped. I realized that my premonition was not a false alarm. In these woods, there truly was something or someone that we must never forget. I sat pressed against the trunk of a tree, trying to still the trembling in my knees. James leaned forward, peering into the thick darkness. It seemed as though a sinister silence was gathering in the air, interrupted only by the sound of wind whispering through the treetops. Then I heard a dull scraping sound, as if claws were dragging along stone. My heart clenched in terror. My imagination instantly painted the outline of a beast lurking among the trees. Within moments, a gigantic silhouette slowly emerged from the dusk. Moonlight, breaking through ragged clouds, illuminated the creature for just a fraction of a second, enough for me to realize that it did not resemble any ordinary animal. Its bulky form evoked that of a bear, yet its head and neck bore distinctly wolfish features. Its powerful paws ended in long claws, and its matted fur was a dark, almost black-brown. But the most terrifying thing was its eyes. They burned with a wild red glare that held no trace of reason, only madness and fury. I felt my breath catch in my throat, barely managing to stifle a scream. The creature turned its head as if sensing our presence and let out a low roar that made the ground shudder beneath my feet. My heart pounded as if it were trying to burst from my chest. James clutched a thick branch as if seeking support, and I instinctively stepped back, hoping to remain unnoticed. But the beast was already catching our scent. Its nostrils flared, and it slowly advanced as if sizing us up before pouncing. In the moonlight, I noticed a deep wound on its right shoulder, from which dark, thick blood flowed. Perhaps this was evidence of that terrible battle between the wolf shapeshifter and the bear shapeshifter that Samuel had spoken of. I understood that every moment of hesitation only brought us closer to mortal danger. The monster roared, rearing up on its hind legs to display its immense strength. It seemed as though before us stood the embodiment of nature's wildest side. There was no room here for mercy or hesitation, only an unbridled desire to tear and destroy. I realized that our presence on its hunting ground was a challenge, and the beast had accepted it. We froze, paralyzed with fear. The silence of the night enveloped us, and for a moment it seemed even the wind had fallen silent, as if horrified by this creature. The beast then leaned forward again, and in its blazing eyes I saw a mad determination. In that moment I understood. We had come face to face with a living legend, and no words or prayers could hold sway over this terrible spawn of darkness. All that remained was to rely on our instinct for self-preservation and to hope we could break free of this deadly trap. Deep inside, a spark of resolve flared, reminding me that escape was our only chance. Without a word, as if by some unspoken signal, we bolted, dashing into the depths of the forest. At first, I only heard my own heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart echoing in my temples. But after a few seconds, the sound of heavy, thudding paws accompanied a roar, the sound of the beast pursuing us, even as we inadvertently challenged it. It felt as if the forest itself had come alive, closing in around us in a tight ring of branches and trunks. Every step was a struggle. Tree roots jutted from the earth as if trying to grab our feet. The ground, slick from recent rains, made every step treacherous. I nearly fell several times, catching a glimpse of James deftly maneuvering between the trunks, arms outstretched to keep his balance. Adrenaline surged through my veins, drowning out all thoughts except one: run, or else it will be the end. The thunder of footsteps behind us grew louder. The beast's heavy breathing seemed to fill the night's silence. At times it felt as if it were right within arm's reach. My imagination conjured images of huge claws lashing out at my back, ready to latch on and tear me apart. Branches whipped across my face, scratching my hands, but the pain was a mere echo compared to the all-consuming terror driving me forward. We wound our way among the trees, desperately trying to shake the creature from our trail. Yet the beast was not only strong but also agile. Its roars and the sound of its paws striking the ground echoed nearby. I began to lose hope, feeling my strength waning while any clear path to safety remained hidden. The trees merged into an impenetrable mosaic of shadows, with only occasional breaks in the canopy letting through fleeting patches of moonlight. Our feet sank into the soft earth, and the wind stung our lungs. At one point, I heard a sharp crack behind me and turned for just a moment. Miraculously, the beast slipped between the pines, tilting its side, and with a howl of fury, charged forward even faster. I saw its eyes flare red, and I knew then that a wounded beast was twice as dangerous, its pain fueling its rage. Suddenly, through the dense undergrowth, I caught a glimmer of moonlight, the edge of a small clearing. I signaled to James, though I wasn't sure he heard me. All I could think was to reach a more open space, where our chances of maneuvering would be better. With every step I felt my strength draining away, my lungs burning with fiery pain. Yet driven by sheer survival instinct, I pushed on, ignoring the searing ache in my muscles and the sharp anxiety in my mind. It seemed that in just a moment the beast would pounce upon us, when staggering we burst into that clearing. Blinking against the sudden brightness of the moon, I turned and saw the creature leaping after us, its heavy breaths like those of a colossal demon emerging from the primordial depths of darkness. For a moment, it looked as though the beast would clamp its bloodthirsty claws around us. But suddenly, the moon vanished behind a thick cloud, and darkness cascaded over the clearing. In that instant, I saw only a vague silhouette of the monster, which appeared to have lost its way. Seizing this brief respite, James and I scrambled toward a nearby slope, where the trees were fewer, and a path between rocks became visible, leading downward. Clambering and grasping at every protrusion, we slid farther away from the ominous sounds. At last, the wind carried new noises, a murmuring stream and the crunch of small stones. We reached a shallow brook that shimmered in the moonlight which reappeared from behind the cloud. The water felt icy, but without hesitation, I plunged in up to my waist, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that dreadful forest. My friend followed, struggling to control his heavy breathing. For a time, the sound of gigantic paws was absent, but we couldn't be sure how far the creature was or how relentless its pursuit might be. After agonizing minutes, we clambered out onto the bank and, looking up, saw the lights of a village in the distance. It was a small settlement on the edge of the reservation. A few more miles lay ahead. But at the sight of those lights, an overwhelming relief washed over me. We were soaked, caked in mud, and scratched by branches, but we were alive. The terror in my soul had not vanished, yet it was slowly replaced by a deep fatigue and gratitude for having escaped the clutches of that nightmarish ordeal. I left the Appalachians a week later, but the memories of that ominous encounter have been indelibly etched in my mind. Even now, whenever I hear a distant howl or see a storm raging over the mountains at night, an inexplicable fear grips me. I recall how James and I fled from the monster, and I realize that in these lands nature harbors secrets beyond the grasp of human reason. Perhaps someday I will return to once again feel the magic of those ancient legends. But for now, I understand. Respect for the forces that slumber beneath the tree canopies is the only key to surviving in a world where the line between reality and mysticism can be so astonishingly thin.